Hi guys, tonight we drift gently into a world that feels almost unrecognizable compared to the one you know now. A world where ice stretches farther than the eye can follow, and the air itself seems to whisper with cold. You are not in a city, not in a village, but in a vast, quiet expanse of frozen earth where survival is not guaranteed, only negotiated one day at a time. The sun hangs low and pale, filtered through heavy skies, casting a soft bluish glow over endless ice and wind-carved snow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you are watching from somewhere in the world right now, drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you. It is strangely comforting to think of all of us sharing the same quiet moment across different nights. Now, dim the lights. You begin by understanding the world you have stepped into. Around 12,000 years ago, Earth is emerging from what scientists often call the end of the last ice age, though the cold still holds much of the planet in its grip. Vast glaciers cover northern continents, stretching like slow-moving rivers of frozen time. Sea levels are dramatically lower than today, exposing wide land bridges that once connected distant places. Humans live as hunter-gatherers, moving carefully through landscapes that are both beautiful and unforgiving. You feel the crunch of frozen ground beneath imagined feet, each step careful, deliberate. The wind carries a sharp, clean bite that settles into your skin. You pull closer into fur-lined clothing, the kind made from stitched animal hides, crafted with bone needles so small and precise that archaeologists still marvel at their ingenuity. Some researchers suggest these early tailoring techniques were surprisingly advanced, while others believe they developed gradually over many generations. You look across the frozen plains and notice how silence dominates everything. It is not a peaceful silence, but a vast one, interrupted only by distant cracking ice or the low call of animals adapted to the cold. Mammoths still roam in some regions, massive silhouettes against white horizons, though their numbers are already beginning to thin. Scholars remain divided on how quickly these changes unfolded, with some arguing for a slow decline driven by climate, while others suggest human hunting played a more significant role. The world feels slow, but not static. Beneath the frozen surface, change is already building. You notice small camps of early humans nestled in sheltered valleys or along rocky outcrops that block the worst of the wind. Smoke rises gently from small fires, curling into the cold air before vanishing inside these camps. Life is quiet but deeply focused. Every action has meaning. Every resource matters. Food is hunted, gathered, shared, and carefully preserved. There is no excess, only survival. A mainstream fact that helps ground this world is that during this period, humans relied heavily on large herd animals for food, clothing, and tools, shaping migration routes across continents. Without these animals, many groups would not have been able to endure the harsh climate. Yet something curious appears in the archaeological record as well, in certain sites. Researchers have found intricately carved objects made from mammoth ivory, including small figurines that suggest symbolic or even spiritual expression. It is a reminder that even in extreme cold, creativity still finds a way to exist. And here is a small, almost strange detail from this time. Some ancient clothing appears to have been sewn so tightly and carefully that it functioned almost like insulation similar to modern thermal wear. Tiny bone needles, sometimes thinner than a pencil lead, were used to stitch hides together in complex layers. It makes you wonder how many generations of experimentation went into something we might now take for granted. You continue walking through this imagined Ice Age world, noticing how everything feels both fragile and enduring at the same time. The sky shifts slowly, clouds moving like heavy thoughts across a pale dome. Light changes gently, never rushing, never harsh. There is a quiet tension in the air, something that scholars continue to debate even today. Some researchers suggest that Ice Age humans were highly adaptable and socially flexible, forming wide networks of communication across great distances. Others argue that groups were more isolated, shaped primarily by local environments and immediate survival needs. The truth, as often happens in deep history, likely sits somewhere in between, lost beneath layers of time and ice. You pause near a frozen river. The water beneath is locked in stillness, yet you can almost imagine it moving, hidden under its glassy surface. Animals leave faint tracks in the snow, already half erased by the wind, somewhere far away. A mammoth calls, its sound low and resonant, fading into the white distance. And in this moment, you begin to sense something subtle. This cold world is not permanent. Ice, no matter how vast, is never truly still. It shifts, it melts, it retreats in ways that are almost imperceptible day by day. Humans living here do not know it yet, but the world is already preparing for a transformation that will reshape everything they understand. You adjust your imagined breath in the cold air and continue forward, surrounded by silence, snow, and the quiet persistence of life on the edge of change. You continue moving through the Ice Age world, but now the landscape begins to feel less like an endless empty wilderness and more like something carefully inhabited, scattered across sheltered valleys and wind-protected ridges. You notice small villages of early humans, not villages in the modern sense, but clusters of life held together by necessity, cooperation, and quiet endurance. The historical background here is important. Around 12,000 years ago, humans lived mostly as mobile hunter-gatherers, organizing themselves into small bands that move with the seasons. These groups are tightly connected, often made up of extended families who depend on shared knowledge of hunting routes, weather patterns, and animal behavior. Life is shaped by movement, but also by brief moments of return to familiar camps that feel almost like home. You step closer to one of these settlements. The first thing you notice is the smell. It is a mix of smoke, animal hide, and something earthy, like crushed plants drying near the fire. The air is cold, but inside the camp it feels warmer, shaped by constant burning wood and the body heat of people gathered together. Low shelters rise from the ground, constructed from mammoth bones, wooden poles, and thick layers of animal skins. These structures are not large, but they are remarkably efficient. The bones form curved frames, almost like ribs of a giant creature turned into architecture. Archaeologists have found similar structures across parts of Europe, suggesting that this design was widely used, though some scholars remain divided on whether these were seasonal shelters or semi-permanent homes. You crouch near one of the fires. Flames flicker softly, casting orange light over faces that are focused, calm, and deeply familiar with hardship. People here do not speak constantly. Instead, communication is often efficient, expressed through gestures, shared routines, and quiet understanding. You might notice how someone carefully tends a piece of meat roasting over the fire, while another repairs a torn hide using bone needles and sinew thread. A mainstream fact becomes clear in this moment. Ice Age humans relied heavily on cooperative hunting strategies, often targeting large herd animals such as reindeer or bison. These hunts required coordination, patience, and trust. No single individual could survive alone for long in this environment. Survival belonged to the group. Nearby, you notice something carved into a small piece of ivory. It is shaped like a simplified animal, perhaps a horse or mammoth, though its exact meaning is uncertain. Some historians suggest these objects were spiritual symbols or teaching tools, while others argue they may have been simple toys or even memory aids used during storytelling. The truth remains debated, hidden behind thousands of years of silence. You also observe something more subtle but deeply human. The people here decorate themselves, not in a modern aesthetic sense, but through practical and symbolic use of materials. Red ochre stains hands and faces, creating patterns that might represent identity, protection, or ritual meaning. Some researchers believe ochre had spiritual significance, while others think it was purely functional, perhaps used for skin protection against cold and insects. Inside one of the shelters, you notice a small stone hollow filled with fat that burns slowly. This is one of the earliest forms of lamps, where animal fat serves as fuel, producing a steady flame. The light is dim but reliable, allowing work to continue long after sunset. It is a quiet innovation, something simple yet essential, and it reminds you that technology here is not about complexity but survival. You settle into the rhythm of camp life. Children stay close to adults, learning through observation rather than formal instruction. Elders sit slightly apart, their presence calm and steady, likely carrying knowledge of migration routes, animal behaviour, and seasonal change. Everyone has a role, even if it is not written or spoken aloud, outside the shelter. The wind moves across the landscape like a slow-breathing motion. Snow drifts in thin layers, covering tracks almost as soon as they're made. And yet, life continues here with a quiet persistence that feels almost fragile, but is in fact deeply resilient. You might wonder how people endured winters like this without modern insulation or heating. The answer is not singular. It is layers of adaptation. Clothing made from carefully sewn hides traps warmth. Fires are maintained continuously. Shelters are positioned to block prevailing winds. And most importantly, people stay together, sharing heat, food, and protection. There is also evidence that Ice Age groups maintained long-distance social networks. Obsidian, flint, and shells have been found far from their original sources, suggesting that materials were traded or passed along through multiple groups. Some historians argue these networks were extensive and highly organized, while others believe they were more sporadic and opportunistic. You watch as someone steps outside the shelter, adjusting their fur cloak. Their breath appears briefly in the cold air before disappearing. The world feels quiet again, but not empty. It is filled with small acts of survival, repeated endlessly across generations. In a corner of the camp, you notice what might be a musical instrument, a flute carved from bird bone. When used, it would produce soft, haunting sounds that carry over the ice. Some scholars suggest such instruments were used in rituals or storytelling, while others believe they were simply forms of entertainment during long winter nights. As you move through the camp, you begin to understand that survival here is not only physical but emotional. These people live with uncertainty, yet they build structure from it. They share food even when scarce. They teach children through repetition and presence. They find rhythm in a world that offers little stability. And slowly, as you stand among them, you sense that this way of life, though ancient, is not primitive. It is deeply intelligent in its own quiet way, shaped by thousands of years of learning how to remain alive in a world that is constantly changing. Outside the camp, the Ice Age landscape stretches endlessly, but here, within these small clusters of warmth and breath, humanity holds on. You leave the warmth of the small Ice Age camp behind, and the world opens again into silence and distance. The air is sharper out here, carrying a dryness that seems to settle in your throat even though you are only observing. Snow stretches in uneven layers across the ground, shaped by wind into soft ridges and shallow valleys. Everything feels paused, as if the world is holding its breath. Before continuing deeper, it helps to understand the larger environmental background. Around 12,000 years ago, Earth is beginning to transition out of the last glacial maximum, the peak of the Ice Age. Massive ice sheets still cover large portions of North America and Northern Europe. Sea levels remain significantly lower than today, exposing vast continental shelves. This creates land corridors that allow humans and animals to move in ways that will later become impossible. You walk along what might have once been a migration route. The ground beneath is frozen but uneven, marked by the passage of hooves and human footsteps that were made long before your imagined arrival. These paths were lifelines. They connected food sources, seasonal camps, and watering areas. Some historians suggest these routes were highly structured and remembered across generations, while others argue they were more flexible, shifting with each season's changes. A cold wind moves across the plains, and you notice how sound behaves differently here. It does not echo like in a forest or city. Instead, it disappears quickly, swallowed by the vastness of snow and open sky. You might hear the faint crunch of ice underfoot or the distant movement of animals, but everything feels muted, softened by cold. As you continue, you come across a frozen river. Its surface is thick and glassy, reflecting a pale, distant light. Beneath it, water still flows in hidden channels, though you cannot see it. This is one of the quiet contradictions of this era. Even in extreme cold, life persists beneath surfaces, waiting for change. A mainstream fact from this period is that glacial melt and retreat were not steady processes. They happened in pulses, with periods of warming followed by sudden returns to cold conditions. These fluctuations had major effects on ecosystems and human migration patterns. Yet researchers continue to debate what triggered these rapid shifts, with theories ranging from solar variation to changes in ocean circulation. You kneel near the river bank and notice animal tracks pressed into the snow. Some are large, likely from reindeer or bison, while others are smaller, possibly wolves following the herds. The ecosystem here is tightly interconnected. Every movement of prey influences predators, and every shifting climate reshapes survival strategies. Nearby, you see something unusual embedded in the frozen soil. It is a carefully shaped stone tool, likely left behind by a hunter long ago. Its edges are sharp, formed through controlled flaking, a technique known as pressure flaking. This method allowed Ice Age humans to create precise blades for cutting meat, scraping hides, and carving wood. Some archaeologists believe the skill developed independently in multiple regions, while others argue it spread through cultural exchange between groups. You hold this moment quietly, imagining the hands that once made it. The tool is small, but it carries immense meaning. It represents planning, patience, and knowledge passed through generations. As you continue walking, the landscape begins to shift subtly. The terrain is less open now, with scattered clusters of hardy shrubs appearing where ice has begun to thin. These small signs of change are easy to overlook, but they mark a significant transformation in Earth's climate system. You might wonder how people living at this time understood such changes. The answer is that they likely experienced them as irregular seasons, unpredictable hunting conditions, and shifting animal migrations. There was no scientific framework for climate, only lived experience. Some historians suggest that Ice Age humans developed deep observational knowledge of weather patterns, while others believe much of this adaptation was reactive rather than predictive. Far in the distance, you notice movement. A herd of large animals crosses the horizon slowly, their silhouettes blending with the pale landscape. Mammoths or possibly steppe bison move with heavy, deliberate steps, their presence both grounding and fragile. These animals are central to survival, providing food, tools, and clothing. Yet their numbers are already beginning to decline in many regions, though scholars still debate the exact timing and causes of their disappearance. You follow the herd from a distance, careful not to disturb them. The wind carries faint sounds, low rumbles and shifting snow. There is a quiet tension in the air, not danger exactly, but awareness. Every creature here is alert, shaped by the constant demands of survival. In this world, movement is life. Staying still for too long can mean scarcity, so humans move with the herds, tracking them across vast distances. Some researchers suggest these migration patterns required remarkable memory and coordination, while others argue that early humans relied more on environmental cues and trial and error than long-term planning. As you walk, the sky begins to shift in tone. It is still pale, but there is a hint of change, a softness that suggests the slow approach of warmer conditions. You do not yet see the full transformation that will eventually reshape the planet, but it is already beginning, hidden in gradual shifts of ice and air. You pause for a moment and look back. The camp you left is no longer visible, swallowed by distance and snow. Ahead, the world stretches endlessly, both familiar and unknown, and in this quiet stretch of time, you begin to sense that Earth itself is in motion, not just through space, but through deep cycles of change that no single human can fully perceive. You continue moving forward, and the world begins to sound different. At first it is subtle, a deeper hum beneath the silence, a distant rushing that does not belong to wind or animals. The frozen landscape is still here, still wide and pale, but something beneath it is waking up. You're stepping into a time when ice begins to lose its grip, and water starts to remember how to move again. To understand this moment, it helps to know what is happening on a planetary scale. Around 12,000 years ago, the last great ice age is ending, and massive glaciers that once covered huge parts of the northern hemisphere are slowly melting. This is not a sudden event, but a long transformation, driven by gradual warming trends in Earth's orbit and atmospheric patterns. As ice retreats, it releases enormous amounts of fresh water into newly forming rivers, lakes, and seas. You follow the sound. At first it is faint, like a distant storm hidden behind hills. Then it grows clearer, more present. You climb a low ridge of snow and ice, and suddenly you see it. A river. But unlike any river you might expect, it is wide, fast, and filled with milky blue water carrying fragments of ice that clink and shift as they move. This is meltwater, born directly from ancient glaciers. You stand at the edge, feeling cold mist touch your face. The air here is different, heavier with moisture. The ground beneath your feet is wet in places, unstable in others. Ice collapses quietly at the edges of the flow, breaking off and drifting downstream. It feels like watching the planet slowly exhale after holding its breath for thousands of years. A mainstream fact from this period is that glacial meltwater significantly reshaped Earth's geography. It carved out valleys, created new river systems, and contributed to the formation of many modern lakes. Entire landscapes were redrawn by water released from melting ice sheets. Yet researchers continue to debate how quickly these processes occurred, with some arguing for gradual change over millennia, while others suggest more rapid pulses of flooding during warmer intervals. You crouch near the riverbank. The water moves with force, carrying sediment and ice fragments that grind softly against each other. It is both destructive and creative at the same time. You notice how the river has already begun to carve into the frozen ground, cutting new channels where none existed before. Nearby, you see something strange in the shifting ice. A cluster of stones arranged in a rough line, partially submerged. These may have once been part of a human campsite, now slowly being reclaimed by water. Archaeologists have found similar sites across former glacial regions, where ancient settlements were later drowned or buried by meltwater in some cases. Entire archaeological layers are preserved beneath lake sediments, waiting to be discovered thousands of years later. You imagine the people who once stood here, watching this same transformation without knowing its global scale. For them, it would not be a scientific event but a lived experience. Rivers appearing where none existed before, hunting paths disappearing under mud and water, new dangers, but also new opportunities. You continue walking along the river's edge. The sound of rushing water follows you, constant and low. Ice flows drift past like slow-moving fragments of time. Occasionally, you hear cracking sounds as larger pieces break apart. The landscape feels unstable, as if the ground itself is learning how to shift. A small detail catches your attention. On a flat stone near the water, there are faint markings, not natural patterns, but deliberate scratches, perhaps symbolic, perhaps practical. Some scholars suggest Ice Age markings like these could represent early counting systems or territorial signs, while others argue they were purely artistic or even incidental. The truth is still uncertain. Buried beneath layers of interpretation, you trace your fingers over the imagined surface of the stone. It feels like a quiet message from someone who lived in a world that was already changing. As you move further downstream, the terrain opens slightly. The ice is thinner here, replaced by wet soil and scattered patches of hardy vegetation. Small green shoots push through the thawing ground, fragile but persistent. This is one of the earlier signs of ecological transformation, where ice once dominated. Life begins to return in new forms. You might notice how different this feels from the frozen plains earlier. There is movement everywhere now. Water flows, soil shifts, plants begin to grow again. Even the air feels less rigid, as if it has loosened slightly. A second mainstream fact becomes important here. As glaciers melted, sea levels rose dramatically over thousands of years, eventually flooding coastal plains and reshaping shorelines across the globe. Many areas that were once habitable land became submerged, forcing human populations to migrate inland. Yet historians remain divided on how quickly coastal flooding occurred, with some suggesting steady rise and others proposing sudden meltwater pulses that caused rapid changes. You imagine what that would have felt like. A familiar shoreline slowly disappearing. Camps that once sat safely near water becoming vulnerable. Entire migration routes needing to be rethought. You stop for a moment and listen again to the river. It is louder now, almost overwhelming in its presence. Yet there is also a strange sense of renewal in it. Water creates as much as it destroys. It shapes the land, but also prepares it for something new. Farther along, you notice animal tracks in the softened ground. Not just the large herbivores you saw earlier, but smaller creatures too, adapting to changing environments. Some are drawn to the new vegetation, others follow the water. Life is reorganizing itself quietly, without announcement. You pause and look across the shifting landscape. It is no longer purely Ice Age, but not yet anything familiar. It exists in between, a transitional world where old and new overlap. And in this in-between space, humanity is also adjusting, not yet settled, not yet fully transformed, but already responding to the changing rhythm of Earth. You begin to sense that this river is more than water. It is a timeline made visible, a flowing record of ice becoming something else entirely. A final scholarly debate phrase fits here. Some historians suggest that these meltwater systems developed gradually and predictably, while others argue that sudden glacial collapses may have caused rapid and chaotic flooding events that reshaped entire regions in a matter of seasons. You continue walking beside the river as it carries fragments of ancient ice away from the world they once knew, and as you move forward, you realize that nothing here is truly still, not the land, not the water, not even time itself. You continue following the river as it winds through a landscape that feels increasingly unfamiliar. The cold is still present, but it is no longer absolute. It comes and goes in layers, like a memory fading at the edges. Patches of snow cling stubbornly to shaded ground, while nearby soil grows darker and softer with meltwater. You're now walking through a world in transition, where Ice Age silence is slowly giving way to something more fluid, more uncertain. To understand what you're witnessing, it helps to step back into the broader environmental picture. Around 12,000 years ago, Earth is experiencing the end of the Pleistocene epoch, a long geological period defined by repeated glacial cycles. As global temperatures rise slightly due to orbital changes, ice sheets begin to retreat. This process is not uniform. Some regions warm faster than others, creating dramatic contrasts across the planet. You notice this contrast immediately. On one side of the river, the land remains pale and frozen, still locked in ancient cold. On the other side, dark soil and early vegetation appear in scattered patches, as if the earth itself is waking in uneven stages. The air carries both chill and moisture, sometimes within the same breath. You step carefully along the riverbank. The ground here is softer now, occasionally sinking underfoot. Meltwater pools in shallow depressions, forming temporary lakes that reflect the pale sky above. These small bodies of water will not last forever. Some will drain, others will expand, and many will shift as the landscape continues to reshape itself. A mainstream fact from this period is that post-glacial environments created entirely new ecosystems. As ice retreated, plants and animals rapidly recolonized exposed land. Species that once lived at the edges of glaciers expanded northward. Yet researchers continue to debate how quickly these ecological expansions occurred, with some arguing for rapid migration within generations, while others suggest slower, step-by-step movement over centuries. You kneel beside one of these shallow pools. The water is still cold enough to sting, but it is no longer frozen. Tiny ripples form as a light wind moves across the surface. You notice small fragments of organic matter drifting within it. Early signs of new biological activity returning to these soils. Nearby, something catches your attention. Cluster of bones, partially exposed in the mud. They are weathered and old, likely from an animal that lived and died during earlier phases of the Ice Age. Over time, melting ground and shifting sediments have revealed them again. Archaeologists often find such remains in periglacial zones, where freeze and thaw cycles preserve and then expose ancient life in cycles that repeat over millennia. You stand quietly for a moment, imagining how many generations of animals and humans have crossed this exact ground without ever seeing what lies beneath it. As you move forward, the river begins to widen. Its flow is less constrained now, no longer confined tightly by frozen banks. Water spills into surrounding lowlands, forming braided channels that split and rejoin like living threads. The sound of movement is constant, a low continuous presence that replaces the earlier silence of ice. A second mainstream fact becomes important here. During the end of the Ice Age, meltwater pulses contributed to significant changes in global sea levels, which rose by more than 100 meters over thousands of years. Entire coastal landscapes disappeared beneath the ocean, yet scholars remain divided on whether these changes occurred steadily or in sudden bursts caused by rapid ice sheet collapses. You try to imagine that scale of transformation. Coastlines erased, plains submerged, rivers extending further inland than ever before. It is difficult to comprehend, even in observation, but standing here, watching water reshape land in real time, it becomes slightly more imaginable. You continue walking, and now you begin to notice something new in the distance, the first signs of denser vegetation, not just scattered shoots, but clusters of grasses and small shrubs forming early networks of life. The land is slowly rebuilding itself. The air here feels different too, less dry, more alive. It carries faint organic scents, something green and growing, mixed with the lingering cold of retreating ice. You might reflect on how humans at this time would have experienced this transformation. For them, it would not be a scientific transition between epochs. It would be a series of practical challenges and opportunities. New plants to learn, new animals appearing, old migration routes changing or disappearing entirely. A small but fascinating detail emerges here. Evidence from some archaeological sites suggests that Ice Age communities may have followed seasonal predictive knowledge systems, observing environmental cues to anticipate animal movement and plant availability. However, other researchers argue that these systems were less predictive and more adaptive, responding to changes as they occurred rather than forecasting them. You walk through a narrow stretch where trees begin to appear. At first, they are sparse and small, but they mark a profound shift. These are not the open, frozen plains of earlier sections. This is the beginning of forested earth returning. The sound changes again. Wind moves differently through branches than it does across ice. It carries softer tones, broken into layers of rustling leaves and shifting twigs. Even silence here feels different, less absolute, more textured. You pause and look back down the river. The path you followed is no longer fully visible, partially obscured by mist rising from warmer ground. It feels as if the world behind you is slowly being rewritten. A final scholarly debate phrase fits here. Some historians suggest that vegetation expansion after the Ice Age was driven primarily by climate stabilization, while others argue that animal migration and soil development played equally important roles in shaping these new ecosystems. You continue forward into this emerging landscape, where ice is no longer the dominant force, but still lingers like a memory beneath everything, and as you walk, you begin to understand that this is not just an ending of an ice age, it is the beginning of something entirely new. You move deeper into this transforming world, where ice no longer defines everything, yet still lingers in quiet corners like an old memory that refuses to disappear completely. The landscape feels softer now, not safe, not fully welcoming, but less absolute in its coldness. The air carries more moisture, and every breath feels slightly heavier, as if the atmosphere itself is learning a new balance, to ground yourself in what is happening. It helps to remember that this period marks one of the most dramatic climate transitions in human history. The end of the last ice age does not unfold evenly. Instead, it moves in waves of warming and brief returns to cold, reshaping ecosystems again and again. These fluctuations affect everything from animal migration to vegetation growth and human settlement patterns. You walk along a stretch of ground where frozen soil begins to break apart into damp earth. Each step leaves a clearer imprint now, no longer instantly erased by dry drifting snow. Small stones emerge from the thaw, their edges softened by time and pressure. It feels like the land is slowly exhaling after being held rigid for thousands of years. Ahead, you notice the remains of what might once have been a hunting site. Arranged stones form a loose circle, partially disturbed by meltwater. The placement suggests deliberate human activity, though its exact purpose is uncertain. It could have been a temporary cooking site, a tool-making area, or a gathering point during seasonal migration. One well-established archaeological understanding is that Ice Age humans often created multi-purpose activity zones near water sources. These spaces were reused repeatedly, layered with generations of occupation. Yet some researchers believe that certain sites may have held more symbolic meaning than purely practical function, possibly tied to seasonal rituals or group identity. You crouch near the stones and imagine the faint warmth that might once have lingered here, smoke drifting upward, voices carried by wind, the soft rhythm of daily survival unfolding in cycles of movement and return. Nearby, something small catches your attention in the soil. It is a chipped piece of flint, carefully shaped with sharp edges still intact despite thousands of years. The craftsmanship is precise, suggesting practiced skill rather than improvisation. Flint tools like this were essential for cutting, scraping, and preparing food. Their design changes subtly over time, allowing archaeologists to trace cultural shifts across regions. There is also something curious about sites like this. Some excavations reveal unusually concentrated clusters of tools, as if people returned to specific places repeatedly over long periods. This has led to interpretations ranging from seasonal camps to early territorial gathering spots. Though no single explanation fully accounts for all findings, you continue walking, and the environment grows noticeably more dynamic. Meltwater channels widen and merge, creating shallow wetlands that reflect fragmented pieces of sky. Reeds begin to appear at the edges, bending gently with the wind. These plants are among the first to colonize newly thawed land, stabilizing soil and preparing it for more complex ecosystems. This soundscape changes again. Instead of the hollow silence of ice or the heavy rush of meltwater alone, you now hear a layered environment, water trickling through channels, wind moving through early vegetation, occasional distant calls of animals adapting to shifting habitats. You might notice how different this feels compared to earlier sections. There is still uncertainty here, but also a sense of emergence. Life is not just surviving anymore, it is reorganizing. A fascinating detail from archaeological studies shows that some Ice Age groups may have used seasonal markers in the landscape, such as specific rock formations or tree lines, to navigate migration routes. These natural landmarks would have been crucial in a world where geography itself was changing. However, interpretations differ, and some experts suggest that oral memory and storytelling played a larger role than physical markers alone. As you move further, you encounter a shallow valley where early shrubs cluster more densely. The vegetation is still young, but it forms the beginning of structured growth. Insects appear in small numbers, drawn by moisture and emerging plant life. This return of smaller ecological systems marks an important step in post-glacial recovery. You pause for a moment and look across the valley. It feels neither fully ancient nor modern. It exists in between states, where everything is still deciding what it will become. One notable scientific observation about this era is that ecological succession after glacial retreat often occurs in stages, beginning with hardy pioneer species and gradually transitioning toward more stable forest systems. Yet some ecologists argue that this process was not always linear, and that sudden climate shifts may have repeatedly reset early ecological development in certain regions. You continue forward, stepping carefully through soft ground and scattered vegetation. The world around you feels increasingly alive, but not yet settled. It is a landscape in negotiation with itself. A small and easily overlooked detail appears near your path, tiny shells embedded in the soil, far from any ocean. These remnants hint at ancient environments shaped by water systems that have long since disappeared or shifted. They serve as quiet reminders that this land has changed many times before, and will likely continue to change again. And as you move through this evolving terrain, you begin to feel something subtle but important. The Ice Age is not simply ending in a single moment, it is dissolving gradually, layer by layer, into something entirely new. You walk on, surrounded by a world that is no longer frozen but not yet familiar. You continue through the slowly awakening landscape, and now the sense of transition becomes impossible to ignore. The ground is no longer uniformly cold or frozen. Instead, it shifts between damp earth, thin layers of lingering frost, and soft patches of early vegetation. It feels like walking across a world that is learning how to be warm again, one uncertain step at a time. To understand this moment more clearly, you are standing in the early Holocene transition, a time when Earth's climate begins to stabilize after thousands of years of fluctuation. Ice sheets are still present in the far north, but they are no longer dominant across much of the mid-latitudes. Rivers expand, forests begin to return, and ecosystems reorganize in ways that will eventually resemble the world we know today. You move into a shallow forest edge. The trees here are not tall yet. They are thin, scattered, and cautious in their growth. Their branches sway gently in a wind that feels less harsh than before. The air carries a soft scent of damp wood and fresh plant life, a contrast to the dry, frozen atmosphere you experienced earlier, underfoot. The soil is richer now. It compresses slightly with each step, holding moisture instead of repelling it. You notice small insects moving through the undergrowth, fragile but present. Their return marks an important ecological turning point, because even the smallest creatures play a role in rebuilding complex food systems. One widely accepted scientific understanding is that post-glacial environments developed biodiversity in waves, with each stage supporting new layers of plant and animal life. Yet researchers continue to explore how quickly these systems stabilized. As some regions show rapid ecological recovery while others appear to have remained unstable for thousands of years, you pause near a cluster of young trees. Their bark is thin and pale, still developing the strength needed for harsher seasons. Light filters through their branches in soft, uneven patterns. It feels almost peaceful here, but beneath that calm is constant transformation. A faint trail appears in the soil ahead, not human this time, but animal. You can see the impression of hooves, partially softened by recent moisture. These paths are important. They connect feeding areas, water sources, and shelter zones. Over time, both animals and humans would rely on these invisible networks carved into the land. Near the trail, you notice a small concentration of broken stone flakes. They're scattered unevenly, as if tools were made and used briefly before being left behind. Such sites are common in transitional landscapes like this, where groups move frequently and leave behind traces of activity that slowly become absorbed into the soil. One lesser-known archaeological detail is that some of these flake clusters appear to be associated with short-term processing of plant materials rather than hunting alone, suggesting a broader diet than previously assumed. However, interpretations vary widely, and some specialists believe these patterns may simply reflect repeated but unrelated visits over time. You continue walking, and the forest becomes slightly denser. Birds begin to appear in distant branches. Their calls soft and irregular. This is a sound that would have been rare or absent during the colder phases of the Ice Age. Their presence signals a growing stability in the environment. The light changes again as clouds pass overhead. Shadows move gently across the ground, revealing uneven textures in the soil and vegetation. Everything feels layered now, as if multiple versions of the landscape are overlapping at once. A well-established historical observation is that human populations during this transition began to diversify their subsistence strategies. Instead of relying solely on large herd animals, many groups began incorporating fishing, small game hunting, and plant gathering more extensively. Yet scholars still discuss whether this diversification was a gradual adaptation or a more abrupt response to environmental pressure. You imagine how this shift might have felt, not as a planned change, but as a slow realization that the world was offering new possibilities alongside old ones. Further ahead, you notice a small clearing where sunlight reaches the ground more directly. In this clearing, early grasses grow in clusters, swaying gently. The soil here is warmer, and you can almost feel the difference in temperature compared to the shaded forest. At the edge of the clearing, there are faint traces of ash mixed into the soil, perhaps an old fire site, long since absorbed by time. Fire has always been a constant companion through these transitions, providing warmth, protection, and a way to transform food. Its presence here connects this changing world back to earlier sections, where survival depended so heavily on its steady glow. One interesting detail from archaeological research is that fire use during this period becomes more spatially organized. with repeated hearth locations suggesting more structured campsite planning. Yet some experts argue that this pattern may simply reflect environmental constraints rather than deliberate organization. You stand quietly for a moment, watching how the forest and open land meet in soft boundaries rather than sharp divisions. Nothing here is fixed. Everything blends, overlaps, and shifts, and as you continue forward, you begin to understand that this world is not simply recovering from an ice age. It is building an entirely new identity, one shaped by warmth returning slowly to the earth. You walk on, surrounded by the quiet rhythm of renewal. You continue forward into a world that is no longer defined by ice, but it is still shaped by memory of scarcity. Even as forests begin to spread and wetlands grow richer, survival is not suddenly easy. Instead, it becomes more complex, more varied, and in some ways even more demanding. The landscape offers new resources, but it also requires new knowledge to understand them. In this period of early Holocene transition, human groups are adjusting to rapidly changing environments. Animal herds no longer move in predictable Ice Age patterns. Plant life expands into regions that were once frozen. Rivers shift course. Lakes form and disappear over generations. For people living through this time, the world feels less like a fixed map and more like a living, changing system. You walk along a gently rising slope where the forest begins to thin again. Here, the soil is mixed with gravel and soft moss. Small clearings open between clusters of trees, and in these spaces you notice signs of repeated human activity. Not permanent settlement yet, but familiar return points, places where people likely stopped, gathered food, and rested before continuing their seasonal movement. Scarcity during this time does not disappear, it simply changes shape. Instead of only struggling against freezing cold and limited game, humans now face unpredictability. Some seasons bring abundance of edible plants, while others offer very little. Animal migration routes shift. Weather becomes less extreme overall, but more variable in timing. A widely accepted understanding among archaeologists is that this transition encouraged greater dietary flexibility in human groups. People began relying more on a combination of fishing, foraging, small game hunting, and plant processing. This diversification is often seen as a key factor in long-term survival. Yet some researchers suggest that these changes were not uniform across regions, and that certain groups remained heavily dependent on large game for much longer than others. You notice a shallow pit in the ground ahead. Inside it are scattered fragments of burnt plant material and small animal bones. This may have been a temporary cooking site. The simplicity of it is striking. There is no permanent structure, only evidence of repeated human presence layered over time. Nearby, you see a cluster of stones arranged in an uneven arc. It might have been used to support a light structure or to contain a small fire. Or it may have had a different function entirely, one that is no longer visible to us. Archaeological interpretation of such features often varies depending on context, and similar formations are sometimes explained as cooking areas, shelter foundations, or even symbolic boundary markers. A quiet detail appears as you move closer to the forest edge. Wild edible plants are becoming more visible now. Small berries, leafy shoots, and early root vegetables emerge in seasonal cycles. Some of these would have been carefully observed by early humans, who gradually learned which plants could be eaten safely and which were best avoided. One lesser-known archaeological insight is that microscopic wear patterns on stone tools suggest early forms of plant processing much earlier than once assumed. This includes grinding, slicing, and scraping techniques used on fibrous vegetation. However, interpretations of these findings remain debated, with some specialists arguing that the evidence may reflect occasional use rather than systematic plant reliance. You continue walking, and the terrain becomes more uneven. roots begin to crisscross the ground, and fallen branches create natural obstacles. The forest here feels younger than the ones deeper in earlier sections, as if it is still assembling itself into a stable ecosystem. A small stream appears ahead, winding gently through the landscape. The water is clear and slow-moving, reflecting fragments of sky and branches above along its edges. You notice signs of animal activity, footprints pressed into soft mud. These waterways become essential lifelines in this changing world, offering both hydration and pathways through dense terrain. In some regions during this time, early human groups began to establish more frequent base camps near reliable water sources. These were not permanent settlements in the later sense, but they show increasing attachment to specific locations. Some researchers interpret this as the beginning of territorial behaviour, while others argue it reflects seasonal convenience rather than ownership. You crouch near the stream. The sound of water is gentle here, not the roaring meltwater of earlier sections, but a steady, calming flow. It feels almost rhythmic, like the landscape breathing at a slower pace. A curious archaeological detail emerges in sites from this period. Some tools show evidence of reuse and repair, with older implements reshaped into new forms. This suggests a growing awareness of resource conservation, or at least practical adaptation to limited materials. Yet there is ongoing discussion among scholars about whether this reflects intentional planning or simple necessity. You notice a small patch of cleared ground nearby, where ash and charcoal are mixed into the soil. Fire continues to be central in this world, not only for warmth and cooking, but also for shaping social life. Even as climates improve, fire remains a constant anchor in daily routines. As you move further along the forest edge, you begin to sense how humans might have experienced this changing environment emotionally, not as a sudden shift, but as a gradual realization that old ways of life no longer always worked in the same way. Knowledge that once guaranteed survival needed to be adjusted, expanded, and sometimes replaced. One well-established observation in archaeology is that this period sees increasing regional variation in human technology and lifestyle. Different groups develop distinct tool styles and subsistence strategies depending on local conditions. However, some experts argue that this variation may be exaggerated by uneven preservation of archaeological sites rather than true cultural divergence. You pass through a narrow corridor of trees where light filters in soft layers. The forest floor is alive with subtle movement, insects, small animals, and the slow growth of plants reclaiming open ground. Everything feels interconnected now in a way that was less visible in the frozen landscapes earlier. And yet, despite all this abundance, uncertainty remains constant. Resources are present, but not guaranteed. Seasons shift in unpredictable ways. Humans must stay observant, flexible, and deeply connected to their environment in order to thrive. As you continue walking, you begin to understand that scarcity has not disappeared. It has simply transformed into something more complex, requiring awareness rather than endurance alone. You move forward through a world that is still learning how to balance itself. You leave the quieter forest edge behind and begin moving toward a different kind of boundary, one that feels less like land and more like uncertainty. The ground gradually flattens, then softens, then begins to change in a way that is almost imperceptible at first. The air carries a faint saltiness now, subtle but persistent, as if the world itself is remembering an ocean that has been absent for thousands of years. To understand what you're approaching, you need to picture a planet where sea levels are rising dramatically over long stretches of time as the massive Ice Age glaciers continue to melt. Enormous volumes of water return to the oceans. Over thousands of years, global sea levels rise by more than 100 meters. Entire coastal plains that were once open land slowly disappear beneath advancing water. This is not a sudden flood, but a patient, relentless transformation that redraws the map of the world. You step onto what feels like the edge of a vast shoreline. The land here is wide and low, stretching outward in a gentle slope before meeting the water. Waves roll in with a slow, steady rhythm, touching the sand and pulling back again as if testing how far they are allowed to go. The ocean looks calm, but there is something unsettling in its persistence. You imagine this same place not as a shoreline, but as open land, grasslands where herds once moved freely, river valleys where humans once travelled without obstruction. In many regions of the world during this time, similar landscapes existed, now submerged beneath modern seas. One of the most studied examples is the vast area that once connected parts of northwestern Europe, often referred to by researchers as a now submerged land bridge. It allowed both animals and humans to move across regions that are now separated by water. A key scientific observation is that post-glacial sea level rise did not happen evenly. It occurred in pulses, influenced by complex interactions between melting ice sheets, ocean circulation, and regional geology. Some areas experienced relatively steady flooding, while others may have seen more rapid changes over shorter periods. Yet there is ongoing discussion among climate scientists and archaeologists about how abrupt these changes truly were in specific regions. You walk closer to the waterline. The sand beneath your feet is damp and cool, compacted by repeated waves. Small fragments of shell are scattered along the shore, evidence of marine life expanding into areas that were once dry land. The sound of the ocean is constant, a low breathing motion that feels both calming and overwhelming at the same time. A fascinating archaeological detail emerges here. In several coastal sites around the world, researchers have discovered ancient shell middens, large piles of discarded shells created by human activity. These remnants show that people living near coastlines relied heavily on marine resources such as shellfish, fish, and seabirds. However, interpretations of these sites vary. Some experts suggest they represent long-term settlements, while others argue they may reflect seasonal gatherings or short-term resource exploitation. You kneel near a cluster of shells half buried in wet sand. They are smooth, worn by time and water. It is strangely quiet here despite the movement of waves. The shoreline feels like a place of transition, where land and sea negotiate without ever reaching agreement. Farther along the coast, you notice something unusual embedded in the wet ground. It is a set of faint impressions preserved in hardened sediment. They look like footprints, though softened by time and erosion. If these are indeed human tracks, they may have been left when this area was still solid ground, before rising waters reached it. Such discoveries have been made in various regions, preserved under layers of sediment or volcanic ash, offering rare glimpses into moments of movement long gone. You trace your gaze along the shoreline and begin to sense how dynamic this boundary once was. It was never fixed. It moved inland over generations, slowly claiming fields, camps, and migration routes. Entire landscapes were lost, but also transformed into new marine environments. In some submerged regions that researchers study today through underwater archaeology, there are traces of forests preserved beneath sediment layers, tree stumps still rooted in ancient soil, now lying beneath modern seas, reveal how quickly some coastlines were overtaken by rising water. Yet there is debate among specialists about whether these changes were gradual enough for human migration to keep pace, or whether certain episodes of flooding occurred too rapidly for effective adaptation. You stand quietly, imagining the experience of people who once lived here. For them, the sea would not be a distant boundary, but a moving force that gradually reshaped their world. A hunting ground that slowly became tidal flats, a familiar river mouth that turned brackish, a camp that once felt safe but became vulnerable to water encroachment. You notice how the wind behaves differently here. It is less obstructed than in the forest, carrying open space with it. The air feels both expansive and exposed. Small waves collapse onto the shore with a soft, rhythmic sound, leaving behind thin lines of foam that quickly dissolve. Another lesser-known detail from archaeological research appears in coastal studies. Some ancient tools recovered from now submerged landscapes show signs of waterwear that suggest they were abandoned gradually, rather than lost suddenly. This supports the idea that humans may have slowly retreated inland as shoreline shifted. However, not all scholars agree, as some argue that abrupt environmental events could also explain these patterns. You begin walking along the coast, the land narrows in places, forming inlets where water extends farther inland. These areas would have been especially dynamic during the Ice Age transition, with tidal forces reshaping terrain regularly. It is easy to imagine how disorienting this must have been for early human groups, watching familiar landmarks slowly disappear beneath water over generations. In the distance, seabirds move across the sky in loose formations. Their presence marks a new ecological layer emerging in this world. Marine and coastal ecosystems expanding into areas once dominated by terrestrial life. Everything is reorganizing, not suddenly, but continuously. You pause again near the water's edge. The waves move forward, then retreat, then return again. Each cycle is small, but together they represent something enormous, a slow rewriting of geography itself. A final scholarly reflection often discussed in this context is that sea level rise after the Ice Age fundamentally reshaped human migration patterns across continents. Though there is ongoing debate about how much of this movement was forced versus strategically chosen, some groups may have adapted early, while others likely followed waterlines only as they changed. You continue along the shifting boundary between land and sea, aware that you are walking across a place that is both disappearing and being born at the same time. Behind you is land still transforming. Ahead of you is water that will continue to rise long after this moment, and in between, you remain in the quiet edge of a world being redrawn. You leave the shifting shoreline behind, but even as you move inland, the memory of water stays with you. The air is still faintly salty in places, carried by wind that travels farther than you can see. The landscape here feels like a place recovering from a long conversation between land and sea, where neither side fully won. As you move inland, it helps to understand that this period is marked by one of the most important ecological reorganizations in Earth's recent history. With rising sea levels reshaping coastlines, humans, animals, and plants are all forced to adjust their routes, habits, and territories. River systems extend, wetlands expand, and new ecological corridors appear where land and water mix. You walk through a low, open stretch of terrain. The ground is soft but stable, dotted with patches of grass that sway gently in the breeze. In some areas, the soil is still damp from ancient flooding, while in others it has begun to dry and firm. It feels like walking across overlapping versions of the same world, each one slightly out of sync with the next. Ahead, you notice a cluster of reeds growing in dense groups. These plants thrive in transitional environments, especially where fresh water meets newly formed wetlands. Around them, small insects move in irregular patterns, drawn to moisture and warmth. This is a sign of ecological recovery, where simple systems begin to stabilize before more complex forests or grasslands fully develop. One widely accepted archaeological understanding is that wetland expansion after the Ice Age created some of the most resource-rich environments for early humans. Fish, birds, and edible plants all concentrated in these areas, making them attractive for seasonal camps. Yet researchers continue to debate how heavily early populations relied on these wetland zones compared to inland hunting grounds. You step carefully through the soft ground, noticing how easily it gives way under pressure. Water is never far here. Sometimes it appears as shallow pools hidden between grasses. Other times it moves just beneath the surface, unseen but present. The land feels saturated with history and change. A faint outline appears ahead, partially obscured by vegetation. As you approach, you realize it is the remains of a human activity site. Small stones form a loose arrangement, and fragments of charcoal are scattered nearby. This was likely a short-term camp, used briefly before being abandoned or relocated. A lesser-known detail from archaeological findings is that many post-glacial sites show evidence of repeated short-term occupation rather than long continuous settlement. This suggests a highly mobile lifestyle, where groups returned to familiar locations seasonally but did not remain permanently. However, some specialists argue that this pattern may reflect preservation bias rather than actual behavioural norms. You kneel near the site. The soil is darker here, enriched by organic material. It feels different under your hand. Warmer in tone even though the temperature remains cool, there is a sense of continuity here, as if many small moments of human life have accumulated in one place without ever fully settling. Nearby, you notice a small, broken tool fragment. Its edges are smooth from use, possibly repurposed from an older implement. Tool reuse becomes more common during this period, reflecting both practicality and careful resource management. Nothing is wasted easily in a world still learning how stable its resources will be. A key scientific observation about this era is that human groups increasingly developed regionally specific tool traditions, shaped by local environments and available materials. Yet there is ongoing discussion among researchers about whether these differences represent cultural diversity or simply environmental adaptation. You continue walking, and the terrain begins to rise gently. The wetlands give way to drier ground, and scattered shrubs replace dense reeds. The sound of water becomes less dominant, replaced by wind moving through open vegetation. In the distance, you see movement. A small herd of animals crosses the landscape slowly, their shapes partially obscured by grass. They move with caution, constantly aware of their surroundings. This constant awareness defines life in this world. Nothing moves without consequence. You pause and watch them disappear into the distance. Their path likely follows ancient routes shaped by generations of movement. Even as landscapes change, certain patterns remain, etched into the behaviour of animals and the memory of humans who follow them. Another interesting detail from archaeological research is that some hunting sites from this period show evidence of strategic positioning near natural choke points, such as river crossings or narrow valleys. However, interpretations vary, with some researchers suggesting these patterns reflect intentional planning, while others believe they are simply the result of repeated environmental constraints. The wind strengthens slightly as you climb higher ground. From here, you can see more of the surrounding landscape, wetlands below, drier grasslands above, and distant tree lines marking the beginning of more stable forest regions. It is a layered world, each ecological zone overlapping with the next. A well-established scientific perspective is that post-Ice Age landscapes underwent rapid ecological succession, with species spreading quickly into newly available habitats. However, some ecologists argue that these transitions were uneven, with certain regions remaining in early stages for much longer due to local climate conditions. You continue walking, following the natural rise of the land. The soil here is firmer, less saturated. Small stones appear more frequently, and vegetation becomes less dense but more resilient. As you move, you begin to notice how interconnected everything has become. Water shapes land, land shapes vegetation, vegetation shapes animal movement, and all of it together shapes human survival strategies. It is no longer a world of pure ice or pure thaw, it's a world of relationships constantly being rewritten. You slow your pace slightly, taking in the quiet rhythm of this evolving terrain. And in this moment, you begin to understand that the end of the Ice Age was never a single event. It was a long, unfolding conversation between Earth, water, and life itself. You are simply walking through one of its quieter chapters. You continue walking into a landscape that feels increasingly layered, as if the Earth is building itself in slow motion. Nothing here is abrupt. Every shift is gradual, almost hesitant. The ground rises and falls in gentle variations, and the air carries a softness that was absent in the earlier frozen world. It is still cool, but no longer hostile in the same way. As you move forward, it helps to recognize that this phase of Earth's history is defined by rapid environmental experimentation. Forests expand into areas recently freed from ice. Wetlands shrink in some regions while forming in others. Animal populations adjust their ranges constantly, following food and temperature patterns that are no longer stable from generation to generation. You step onto higher ground, where the soil becomes firmer and drier. Small clusters of grass bend in the wind, their movement slow and steady. The horizon opens slightly, giving you a wider view of the surrounding world. From here, you can see how fragmented everything is. Wetlands in low areas, shrubby patches in transitional zones, early forests forming at the edges. This kind of patchwork environment is one of the defining features of post-Ice Age landscapes. Ecosystems do not return as complete systems all at once. Instead, they rebuild in stages, with different regions advancing at different speeds depending on temperature, moisture, and soil stability. You notice faint traces of movement in the soil ahead, animal tracks, partially softened by wind and time. They are not from a single species but layered over each other, suggesting repeated crossings of this area. Migration corridors like this become essential during periods of environmental change, guiding both humans and animals through shifting terrain. A well-established archaeological observation is that many early post-glacial pathways align closely with natural ecological boundaries, such as the edge between forest and grassland or the transition between wetland and upland terrain. These edges often provide the richest combination of resources. However, some researchers argue that these alignments may be coincidental rather than deliberately followed routes. You crouch slightly and examine the ground. It is alive with subtle detail. Tiny insects move through the grass. Small stones are embedded in the soil, worn smooth by repeated environmental cycles. Everything feels like it has been slowly rewritten by water and wind over thousands of years. A little further ahead, you notice a cluster of darkened soil mixed with ash. It is faint, almost blending into the surrounding ground, but still visible if you look closely. This suggests a small fire site, likely used briefly before being abandoned. Fire remains one of the most consistent elements in human life across this entire transition. Even as environments change, fire anchors daily routines. One interesting detail uncovered by archaeologists is that fire residues from this period sometimes appear in isolated patches rather than continuous hearths, suggesting highly mobile groups who repeatedly return to certain spots. Some specialists interpret this as seasonal movement patterns, while others believe it reflects opportunistic use of landscape features rather than planned return visits. You continue forward, and the vegetation becomes more varied. Not dense forest yet, but no longer simple grassland either. Small shrubs, young trees, and flowering plants begin to appear together in overlapping clusters. The air carries faint floral scents mixed with damp earth. In the distance, you hear birds again. Their presence is more frequent now than in earlier sections. Bird populations tend to expand quickly into new ecological niches, and their return is often one of the first audible signs of environmental stabilization. You might notice how different this feels compared to the frozen world earlier in the journey. There is more sound now, more movement, more layered life. But there is also more unpredictability. Stability is still forming, not yet established. A smaller but intriguing archaeological detail appears in some sites from this period. Certain stone tools show polishing patterns that suggest repeated use in both plant and animal processing tasks. This flexibility hints at a broadening of subsistence strategies. Although some experts caution that such interpretations may overstate how systematic these behaviours were across all groups, you walk through a narrow passage between two rising patches of vegetation. The wind shifts here, funneling gently through the gap. It feels almost like the landscape is breathing around you as you emerge. The land opens again into a broader stretch of mixed terrain. Grasslands blend into early woodland edges, and scattered shrubs mark transitional zones. Nothing here is fixed. Everything overlaps. A well-supported scientific understanding of this era is that ecological boundaries were highly fluid, with species moving frequently between habitats as conditions changed. Yet there remains discussion among environmental historians about whether these movements were primarily climate-driven or influenced equally by interspecies competition. You pause for a moment and look across the layered landscape. It feels neither ancient nor modern. It exists in a middle state where everything is still deciding what it will become, and as you continue forward, you begin to sense that this world is not simply recovering from an ice age. It is actively constructing a new version of itself, one slow shift at a time. You walk on, surrounded by quiet transformation. You continue forward, and the land begins to feel even less like a frozen memory, and more like a living system experimenting with its own possibilities. The air is noticeably softer now, carrying warmth that arrives in uneven waves. Some moments feel almost mild, and then, just as quickly, a cool breath returns, reminding you that stability is still far away. As you move deeper into this changing world, it helps to understand that this stage of the early Holocene is marked by rapid ecological expansion. Forests are spreading into former tundra zones. Rivers are adjusting to new meltwater inputs. Animals are redistributing themselves across continents, following food sources that are no longer fixed in place. You walk along a gently sloping ridge where visibility opens again. From here, the landscape feels vast but no longer empty. It is filled with gradients of life, pale grasses in the foreground, shrubs and young trees in the middle distance, and beyond that, darker forest edges that suggest deeper ecosystems taking shape. The ground beneath your feet is firmer here, though still uneven. It carries a mix of dry soil and small stones, shaped by long cycles of freeze and thaw. You notice how the land seems to hold traces of its previous states: ice, water, and now vegetation all layered into the same surface. A widely accepted archaeological understanding is that during this period, human groups increasingly organized their movements around seasonal resource zones rather than fixed territories. These zones shifted over time, requiring constant adaptation. However, some researchers propose that in certain regions, groups may have developed more stable territorial patterns earlier than previously believed. You pause near a patch of wild plants growing in uneven clusters. Some are edible, others medicinal, and many likely went unrecognized or unused by early humans at first. Learning the landscape in this era was a gradual process, built through observation, trial, and memory passed between generations. A small but interesting detail from archaeological findings is that microscopic residue analysis on stone tools often reveals traces of plant processing, including seeds and fibrous materials. This suggests that plant use was more significant than earlier interpretations assumed. Yet there is still discussion about whether this represents widespread reliance or localized adaptation. You continue walking, and the vegetation becomes slightly denser. Small trees form scattered groups, their branches thin but growing steadily. Light filters through them in soft patterns, shifting as the wind moves. The forest is not fully formed yet, but it is clearly becoming more structured. Bird calls are more frequent here, echoing lightly through the trees. Their presence adds a sense of rhythm to the environment, as if the land itself is developing a pulse. You notice how sound behaves differently now compared to the Ice Age silence earlier in your journey. It is layered, continuous, and alive. A faint trail appears ahead, barely visible at first. Then, as you follow it, you realize it is shaped by repeated movement, likely animals, possibly humans, or both. These shared pathways become increasingly important in transitional landscapes, where natural corridors guide movement through changing terrain. One established scientific observation is that post-glacial ecosystems often develop along these movement corridors, as both animals and humans influence vegetation growth through repeated passage. Yet some ecologists suggest that climate and soil composition play an equally strong role, making it difficult to separate human impact from natural processes. You step carefully along the path. The soil here is slightly compacted, suggesting frequent use. Small stones are displaced to the sides. Grass grows differently along the edges, bent and shaped by passage over time. A little farther on, you notice a shallow depression in the ground containing fragments of charcoal and broken stone pieces. This likely marks another temporary campsite. Fire continues to appear as a consistent thread across this entire landscape. It is not only a tool, but a centre of gathering, shaping both survival and social life. A lesser-known archaeological insight is that some of these temporary sites show evidence of repeated reoccupation across long periods, sometimes separated by generations. This suggests that certain locations held enduring importance, possibly due to water access or migratory positioning, although interpretations vary widely among specialists. You move past the site, and the land begins to open again. The forest thins slightly, giving way to mixed grassland and scattered shrubs. The transition feels smooth rather than abrupt, as if the environment is still negotiating its own structure. In the distance, you see movement, not clearly defined yet, but present. A small group of animals crossing between vegetation patches. Their movement is cautious, synchronized, and deeply attuned to the environment. Survival here depends on constant awareness, not only of predators, but of shifting terrain itself. You pause and watch them disappear into the vegetation. Their paths likely follow ancient rhythms shaped by climate, instinct, and learned behavior passed across generations. A well-supported scientific perspective is that during this period, ecosystems were highly dynamic, with frequent shifts in species distribution. However, some researchers argue that certain core ecological structures remain surprisingly stable despite rapid environmental change, especially in regions less affected by glacial retreat. You continue forward, and the landscape feels increasingly balanced between openness and enclosure, neither fully forest nor fully grassland, but a blend of both. It is a world in negotiation with itself, still deciding what it will become, and as you walk through this evolving terrain, you begin to understand that stability here is not a destination, is a process unfolding slowly across time. You move on, surrounded by a world quietly assembling its future. You continue onward, and the landscape begins to feel as if it is gaining memory. Not human memory exactly, but something built from repetition, from cycles of growth and retreat, from water and wind slowly writing themselves into the soil. The air is warmer now in noticeable ways, yet still unpredictable, as if the climate itself has not fully committed to its new direction. As you move deeper into this period of transformation, it is important to understand that Earth is not simply warming in a straight line. The early Holocene includes abrupt climate fluctuations, brief returns to colder conditions, and regional variations that could dramatically alter local environments within a single generation. For humans and animals living through it, stability was never guaranteed. You walk across a gently undulating plain where grasses sway in uneven clusters. Some areas are dense and green, while others remain sparse and dry. This patchiness reflects how newly developing ecosystems often behave after major climate transitions. Growth does not arrive evenly. It spreads, pauses, then expands again. The soil here feels different beneath your steps. It is more cohesive, holding together rather than breaking apart like frozen ground. Small insects move through it in greater numbers now, and their presence subtly changes the sound of the environment. Even silence feels less empty than before. A widely recognized archaeological insight is that during this transitional period, human groups began to intensify their use of diverse ecological zones, moving fluidly between forests, grasslands, and wetlands depending on seasonal availability. However, there is ongoing discussion about whether this mobility represented increased sophistication or simply necessity driven by unstable conditions. You notice a faint rise in the terrain ahead as you approach it. The vegetation changes again. Shrubs become more frequent, and small clusters of young trees appear in irregular patterns. Their spacing suggests that wind, soil quality, and water availability are all influencing growth in different ways. A small but intriguing detail from archaeological studies is that pollen analysis from sediment layers shows rapid shifts in plant composition during this era. Entire plant communities appear and disappear within relatively short geological periods. Yet researchers continue to debate whether these changes were primarily climate-driven or influenced by interactions between species and soil development processes. You continue walking and come upon a shallow hollow in the ground where water is collected. It is not a large body of water, more like a seasonal pool. The surface reflects fragments of sky and passing clouds. Around its edges, you see signs of animal activity, footprints softened by moisture and time. Water sources like this become increasingly important in post-glacial environments. They act as gathering points for animals and, indirectly, for humans. Even small changes in their location can alter movement patterns across entire regions. A lesser-known archaeological detail is that some early post-Ice Age sites show repeated seasonal occupation around temporary water bodies, suggesting that groups tracked these shifting resources closely. However, interpretations differ, and some scholars argue that such patterns may reflect opportunistic movement rather than deliberate long-term planning. You kneel near the water's edge. The surface is still, disturbed only occasionally by small ripples. The air here feels slightly cooler, shaped by evaporation and shade from nearby vegetation. It is a quiet contrast to the open grassland you crossed earlier. As you stand again and continue forward, the terrain begins to rise gently. The view expands, revealing a broader mosaic of ecosystems. Grasslands stretch in one direction, wetlands in another, and early forest clusters mark the edges of more stable regions. A well-supported scientific observation is that this kind of ecological mosaic was common during post-glacial transitions, with multiple habitats coexisting in close proximity. Yet some environmental historians suggest that this apparent stability may be misleading, as underlying climate variability continued to reshape these zones over long periods. You walk slowly through this layered environment, noticing how every step brings subtle changes in sound and texture. The wind moves differently depending on vegetation density. The ground shifts in firmness depending on moisture. Even light behaves differently as it passes through grass, shrubs, and scattered trees. A small detail catches your attention near a patch of taller grass. Broken stone fragments lie partially buried in the soil. Their edges are worn but still recognizable as deliberately shaped tools. They suggest human presence, though not necessarily permanent occupation. You imagine brief moments of activity here, people passing through, fire briefly lit, tools used and left behind, then silence returning, allowing the land to reclaim everything slowly. Another archaeological insight from this era is that many tool assemblages show evidence of short-term, highly mobile usage patterns, consistent with groups that moved frequently across landscapes. However, there is still debate about whether mobility increased during this period, or whether it simply became more visible in the archaeological record due to better preservation conditions. You continue forward, and the land begins to feel more structured again. Not rigid, but organized in repeating patterns. Vegetation clusters around moisture. Animals follow predictable paths between resources. Water shapes movement. Movement shapes vegetation. Everything is interconnected in subtle, continuous feedback loops. As you walk, you begin to sense how deeply responsive this world is. Nothing here exists in isolation. Every element influences another, forming a system that is still stabilizing but already complex. And in this slow unfolding, you realize that what you're witnessing is not just environmental change. It is the formation of a new ecological order, one that will eventually support entirely different ways of human life. You move on, surrounded by a world still quietly arranging itself into balance. You continue forward, and the landscape that once felt like it was steadily warming begins to change its mind. At first, it is subtle. The air feels a little sharper in the morning. The wind carries a colder edge that was not present before. The grass, which had been growing more confidently in earlier sections, now appears thinner in some places, as if it is hesitating. Nothing is fully reversed, but everything feels slightly unsettled, like the earth has paused mid-breath. To understand what is happening, you are entering a period known in climate science as the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to colder conditions that briefly interrupts the general warming trend at the end of the Ice Age. It does not last forever in geological terms, but for ecosystems and human groups living through it, it can span many generations. Ice advances again in some regions. Temperatures drop. Familiar patterns of plant and animal life begin to shift once more. You walk across ground that now feels less forgiving. The soil is firmer again, sometimes crusted with thin layers of frost in shaded areas. Patches of vegetation that seemed stable before now look uneven, as if struggling to keep pace with the changing air. It is not a return to the deepest ice age, but it is a reminder that progress in nature is rarely linear. Ahead, you see a shallow valley where cold air settles more easily. Mist lingers there longer than in surrounding areas. The light feels dimmer, softened by thin clouds passing overhead. The world is not collapsing, but it is adjusting, recalibrating in ways that are not immediately predictable. One well-documented scientific observation is that this abrupt cooling event likely occurred due to disruptions in ocean circulation, particularly changes in how meltwater from retreating ice sheets flowed into the North Atlantic. This may have slowed heat transport across the planet, yet researchers continue to debate the exact triggering mechanism, with some emphasizing oceanic feedback loops while others point to atmospheric instability or combined multi-system interactions. You step carefully through this cooler terrain. The vegetation changes again, not disappearing, but becoming more resilient. Hardy grasses return in greater proportion, and tree growth appears slowed in some areas. The landscape feels as if it is remembering an older version of itself. A faint sound reaches you on the wind. It is not the dense silence of the earlier Ice Age, nor the layered soundscape of the warmer forests, but something in between. A quieter world, where movement feels slightly muted again. Even birdsong seems less frequent here, appearing in brief, scattered moments rather than constant presence. You come across a stretch of ground where frozen soil lies just beneath the surface again. It is not a full return to glaciation, but it is enough to change how water moves through the land. Small pools begin to freeze overnight. Morning light reveals thin ice layers that melt as the day warms, only to return again later. A widely observed detail in paleoclimate records is that this cooling phase is recorded clearly in ice cores from Greenland, where abrupt temperature shifts appear as sharp transitions in trapped gas and dust layers. These records show how quickly climate can change on a planetary scale. However, there is ongoing discussion about how uniformly this cooling affected different regions, as some areas appear to have experienced milder or delayed responses. You continue walking, and you notice something familiar but altered. Animal tracks cross the ground again, but their frequency seems reduced compared to earlier sections. The herds are still here, but their movement patterns appear adjusted. Some may have shifted their migration routes in response to changing vegetation and temperature. In the distance, you see a small rise where wind moves freely across open ground. The grass there bends low, shaped by persistent cold air currents. It feels exposed, almost like the landscape is more vulnerable than before. A small but intriguing archaeological detail from this period is that some human tool assemblages show signs of renewed emphasis on hunting larger herd animals again, possibly reflecting changes in prey availability during cooler phases, yet interpretations differ, with some researchers suggesting continuity in hunting strategies rather than a true shift in behaviour. You kneel near the ground and touch the soil. It feels colder now, denser in places where moisture has frozen overnight. The land is not static, but it is less generous than in the previous section. It requires more attention again, more awareness of subtle environmental cues. As you rise and continue forward, you notice a shallow depression filled with partially frozen water. The surface is thin and fragile, cracking slightly as temperature changes. Around it are signs of animal activity, but less frequent than before. It feels like a resource that is becoming more contested again, even if only temporarily. One lesser-known detail from environmental archaeology is that pollen samples from this interval show a temporary decline in forest species in some regions, replaced again by more cold, tolerant vegetation. However, this pattern is not universal, and some areas show minimal disruption, leading to ongoing debate about how geographically variable this cooling event truly was. You move through this altered landscape slowly. The sense of expansion from earlier sections has tightened again, as if the world has drawn closer around itself. It is still alive, still changing, but less open in its generosity. In a sheltered area between low hills, you notice a small scatter of stone fragments. They appear deliberately shaped, though weathered by time. This suggests human presence even during this colder phase. People did not leave this world, but they adapted to its fluctuations, following shifting resources and adjusting their movement patterns accordingly. A quiet archaeological insight is that some habitation sites from this period show repeated short-term occupation with long gaps in between, suggesting that groups may have returned to certain locations only when conditions became favourable. Yet some specialists argue that this interpretation may reflect preservation bias rather than actual intermittent use. You stand for a moment in this quiet space. The air is colder here, but not unbearable. It carries a crispness that feels almost clean, though less forgiving than the warmth that preceded it. The world around you is not moving backward. It is oscillating, testing boundaries, adjusting its own systems before settling into a more stable pattern. And as you continue walking, you begin to understand that Earth's transformation is not a straight line from cold to warm, but a series of pulses, pauses, and reversals that shape everything living within it. You move forward through a world briefly remembering its colder past. You continue through the cooler world, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, The sharpness in the air begins to soften again, not all at once, and not in a way you can immediately trust, but enough that you notice small changes returning. The frost does not cling as long in the mornings, the wind loses some of its bite, light feels a little less filtered, a little more present. As you move forward, it helps to understand that the Younger Dryas does not last forever. It is a temporary interruption in the long transition out of the Ice Age. Eventually, the climate system shifts again, and warming resumes across much of the planet. Ice sheets begin to retreat once more. Ecosystems restart their expansion, this time with fewer reversals. You walk into a landscape that feels like it is cautiously opening its eyes again. The grass returns in thicker patches, no longer as sparse as before. Small flowers begin to appear in sheltered areas, their colours subtle against the earth tones of soil and stone. The ground is still cool, but no longer feels resistant to life. A widely recognised climatic pattern shows that after abrupt cooling events like this, warming phases often resume with noticeable speed in geological terms. Ice cores from polar regions capture this rebound clearly, showing relatively rapid temperature increases after the colder interval. Yet researchers continue to debate how evenly this warming was experienced across different regions of the globe. You step into a shallow basin where water has gathered again, this time less frozen and more fluid. The surface reflects a pale sky broken by soft clouds. Around it, reeds begin to re-establish themselves, bending gently with the wind. The sound of water here is calm, steady, and familiar in a way that earlier sections were not. A small but fascinating detail from environmental archaeology is that plant succession after this cold interruption appears to restart quickly in many regions, with early colonizing species returning first. However, some ecologists argue that local soil conditions and seed availability played an equally important role in how fast recovery occurred. You continue walking and notice that animal movement is increasing again. Tracks appear more frequently in the soft ground. Birds are more active overhead, their calls spreading across open spaces that had felt quieter in the previous section. The world feels as though it is slowly repopulating itself. Ahead, you enter a mixed landscape of grassland and early woodland. Trees are more established now, their trunks thicker and their spacing more organised. The forest is no longer tentative. It feels like it is beginning to take hold in a more permanent way. You might notice how different the atmosphere feels compared to the earlier cold phase. It is not just temperature, it is density of life. Sound carries further now. Movement is more continuous. Even stillness feels less absolute. A well-supported archaeological observation is that human groups during this renewed warming phase appear to expand their ranges again, following the return of more predictable ecological zones. Yet there is ongoing discussion about whether this expansion reflects population growth or simply increased visibility in the archaeological record due to better preservation conditions. You walk along a narrow trail that seems to have been used repeatedly. The ground is compacted, and vegetation grows differently along its edges. This suggests continued movement through the area, likely by both animals and humans over time. These shared pathways become increasingly important in landscapes that are no longer static. A subtle detail emerges nearby. Small fragments of worked stone lie partially hidden in the soil. Their edges are refined, suggesting careful shaping and reuse. This reflects a continued adaptation to available resources, as groups refine tools to match changing environments. One lesser-known insight from archaeological studies is that tool styles in this period begin to show greater regional diversity, possibly reflecting localized adaptation strategies. However, some researchers caution that this apparent diversity may also result from uneven preservation or sampling bias in excavation sites. You continue forward, and the land opens again into a broad, gently rolling plain. Grass dominates here, but it's no longer the sparse, cold-adapted type seen earlier. It grows in thicker clusters, moving in waves under the wind. The horizon feels wider, less constrained. In the distance, you see a small herd of animals moving steadily across the plain. Their movement is coordinated and calm, suggesting stable migration patterns returning to the landscape. This stability is important. It means food sources for humans are also becoming more predictable again. You pause and watch them disappear into the distance. Their paths trace invisible lines across the land, lines that humans will likely follow in parallel. A quiet archaeological observation is that many sites from this period show increasing evidence of repeated seasonal occupation, suggesting that groups may have begun returning to familiar locations more reliably as conditions stabilized. Yet interpretations vary, with some scholars arguing that mobility remained the dominant pattern despite improved environmental stability. You kneel briefly and touch the ground. It feels warmer than before, not dramatically, but enough to notice. The soil holds moisture differently now, supporting a wider range of plant life. Small insects move through it in steady activity, a sign of rebuilding ecological complexity. As you rise again, you notice how the landscape feels less like it is reacting and more like it is settling. The changes are still happening, but they are less erratic. There is a sense of rhythm returning, and as you continue forward, you begin to understand that this world is not simply recovering from disruption. It is reorganizing itself into a more stable pattern, one that will eventually support more permanent human settlement. You walk on through a landscape quietly finding its balance again. You continue forward, and the world around you begins to feel less like a temporary recovery and more like a system learning its long-term shape. The land is steadier now, not fully predictable, but no longer constantly shifting between extremes. The air carries a softer consistency, with warmth settling more reliably into the soil, the water, and the vegetation. As you move deeper into this phase of the early Holocene, human life is also changing in quiet but important ways. Groups are no longer only reacting to environmental pressure. They are beginning to shape their surroundings more intentionally, even if in small and gradual steps. The relationship between people and landscape becomes more reciprocal, each influencing the other over time. You walk across a broad stretch of mixed grassland and young woodland. The trees are more established here, their canopies beginning to form loose patterns that filter sunlight into shifting shapes on the ground. The grass beneath them grows in thicker clusters, bending gently with the wind. The entire scene feels more structured than in earlier sections, as if nature is organizing itself into recognizable systems. Underfoot, the soil is rich and varied. It holds traces of earlier environments, layered with organic matter from plants that have grown and decayed through cycles of change. Tiny movements in the earth reveal insects and microorganisms rebuilding complex ecological networks that had been disrupted during colder phases. A widely accepted view in archaeology is that this period marks a significant increase in the diversity of human subsistence practices. Communities are increasingly drawing from multiple food sources, combining hunting, fishing, and gathering in flexible ways. Yet some researchers suggest that this diversification may have existed earlier than previously thought, only becoming more visible in the archaeological record during this time. You follow a faint path that winds through the grassland. It is not sharply defined, but it is clearly used. The vegetation bends slightly along its edges, suggesting repeated passage. These kinds of informal routes often form naturally when both animals and humans move through landscapes over long periods. A small but intriguing detail appears near the trail. You notice scattered stone fragments with smooth edges and signs of careful flaking. Some appear to have been reworked multiple times, reshaped into new forms as older tools wore down. This kind of reuse reflects a practical response to changing resource availability, but also shows a deep familiarity with materials and technique. You continue walking and notice that the soundscape has become more layered again. Wind moves through grass in continuous waves, birds call from scattered trees, insects add a faint, constant background rhythm. It is no longer the sparse sound of colder landscapes, but a fuller, more complex environment. As you move, the train begins to rise gently from this elevated position. You can see a wide mosaic of ecosystems stretching outward. Grasslands blend into wetlands, and young forests mark the boundaries of more stable regions. Nothing here is uniform. Everything exists in overlapping gradients. A well-supported archaeological understanding is that during this phase, human groups increasingly occupied ecotones, the transitional zones between different ecosystems. These areas provided access to a wider range of resources within short distances. However, there is ongoing discussion among researchers about whether this was a deliberate strategy or simply a result of following resource availability. You pause near a small cluster of wild plants growing along the edge of a shallow depression. Some are edible, others likely medicinal, and many would have required careful knowledge to distinguish safely. Learning the landscape in this era was an ongoing process, built through observation and experience rather than formal instruction. A lesser-known archaeological insight is that residue analysis on grinding stones and cutting tools from this period sometimes reveals a surprising variety of plant processing activities. This suggests that plant use may have been more complex than earlier interpretations assumed. However, some specialists caution that these findings may not represent widespread dietary patterns across all regions. You continue forward and notice a small water channel cutting through the terrain. It moves slowly, reflecting the sky in broken fragments along its banks. Vegetation grows more densely, forming narrow corridors of life. These water pathways become essential structuring features in post-glacial landscapes, guiding both animal movement and human travel. As you follow the channel, the ground becomes slightly softer. Occasional footprints appear in the damp soil, some fresh, others softened by time. They overlap and diverge, suggesting repeated use of this route over many seasons. You might imagine how people would have experienced this environment, not as a fixed map, but as a shifting network of reliable and unreliable paths. Knowledge of where to find water, game, and safe passage would have been essential, passed through memory, repetition, and careful observation. A quiet archaeological detail from this period is that many campsites show evidence of short-term but repeated occupation, with layers of hearths and tool debris indicating return visits over time. Some researchers interpret this as early forms of seasonal territorial familiarity, while others suggest it reflects simple convenience and environmental predictability. You walk past another open area where grass grows in uneven patches. The land here feels balanced, neither too dense nor too sparse. It is the kind of environment that supports both movement and temporary settlement, a flexible middle ground between extremes. As you continue, you begin to sense a subtle shift in how everything fits together. The ecosystems are no longer in rapid transition. They are beginning to stabilize into repeating patterns, not fixed, but structured enough to be recognizable. And in this growing stability, you can feel the foundation of a new world taking shape, one that will eventually support more permanent human presence and more complex social organization. You move forward through a landscape that is quietly becoming familiar to itself. You continue forward, and the landscape now feels noticeably more settled, as if the Earth has finally stopped experimenting quite so aggressively with its own surface. The changes are still present, but they unfold more gently, like slow breathing rather than sudden shifts. The air carries a steadier warmth, and even the wind seems less erratic than in earlier sections of this long journey. As you move deeper into this stabilized phase of the early Holocene, forests are no longer just returning in scattered patches. They are beginning to form more continuous systems. Grasslands remain important, but they are increasingly bordered and shaped by expanding woodland. Wetlands still exist, but they are more defined, less chaotic than before. The planet is not finished changing, but it's clearly settling into a new rhythm. You walk along a gentle slope where trees now stand closer together. Their trunks are thicker, their roots more deeply embedded in soil that feels richer and more mature. Sunlight filters through the canopy in soft, broken patterns that shift as the wind moves above. The forest floor is alive with small plants, fallen leaves, and quiet movement. A widely supported archaeological observation is that this period sees a noticeable increase in long-term human site organization in some regions, with more structured use of space within camps. This includes repeated fire locations, designated activity areas, and more consistent tool production zones. Yet some researchers argue that this apparent organization may reflect preservation bias, since more structured sites are simply easier to detect in the archaeological record. You follow a narrow track that winds through the forest. The ground here is firm but cushioned by layers of organic matter. Roots cross beneath the surface, creating subtle patterns of resistance as you walk. The air feels cooler in the shade, but it is no longer harsh. It carries a damp, earthy scent that suggests long-term ecological stability. A small but interesting detail emerges as you move forward. You notice clusters of plant species growing in repeated combinations, almost as if certain ecological partnerships are becoming established. Some plants seem to consistently appear near others, forming early signs of interdependent forest systems. However, ecologists continue to debate how much of this pattern is due to natural succession versus long-term climatic stabilization. You step into a clearing where light falls more directly. The grass here is taller and more resilient than earlier sections, bending in waves under gentle wind. Insects move in greater numbers now, and their presence adds a subtle hum to the environment. The forest is no longer quiet in the sparse sense. It is full, layered, and continuous. As you cross the clearing, you notice faint impressions in the soil. They're partially obscured by vegetation, but their shapes suggest repeated passage by both animals and humans. These overlapping tracks create invisible networks across the landscape, connecting resources, water sources, and shelter areas. A well-established archaeological understanding is that during this time, human mobility patterns become increasingly structured around seasonal cycles that are more predictable than in earlier periods. However, there is ongoing discussion about whether this predictability reflects true environmental stability or simply improved adaptation strategies by human groups. You continue walking and enter another section of forest where the canopy is denser. The light here is softer, filtered through layers of leaves. The sound of movement changes again, instead of open wind. You hear rustling branches and distant bird calls. Everything feels more enclosed, more intimate. A small detail catches your attention near the base of a tree. Stone fragments lie scattered in a loose cluster. Their edges are shaped, though worn by time. This suggests repeated human activity, possibly tool-making or repair work. Such finds are common in forested environments of this period, where mobile groups leave behind traces of short-term occupation. A lesser-known archaeological insight is that tool assemblages from forested Holocene sites often show greater emphasis on composite tools, where multiple materials are combined into a single implement. This reflects increasing technical complexity, though some specialists argue that this interpretation may overstate the uniformity of technological development across regions. You move deeper into the forest, and the environment becomes even more structured. Trees form natural corridors, and open spaces appear in predictable intervals. Light and shadow alternate in slow, rhythmic patterns. The world feels less like a transition and more like a system that has found a stable operating mode. As you walk, you begin to notice how integrated everything has become. Water flows through defined channels. Plants organize into layered communities. Animals move along established routes. Even human traces, though faint, align with the broader structure of the landscape. A quiet environmental observation is that ecosystems in this phase often show increased resilience compared to earlier transitional periods, though they remain sensitive to long-term climatic fluctuations. Yet some environmental historians caution that this apparent resilience may mask underlying vulnerability to sudden change. You pause in a quiet section of forest. The air is still, but not empty. It is filled with subtle life. Insects moving through leaves, distant bird calls, the faint rustle of wind above the canopy. It is a soundscape that feels balanced, as if all elements are in conversation with each other, and as you continue forward, you begin to sense that the world is no longer simply recovering or adjusting. It is now maintaining itself, holding a fragile but persistent equilibrium. You move on through a landscape that feels increasingly whole. You continue deeper into the forested world, and now the feeling of transition fades almost completely. The landscape no longer feels like it's becoming something else. Instead, it feels established, as if it has entered a long period of quiet confidence. The air is stable, neither too cold nor too warm, and the wind moves through the trees with a steady, familiar rhythm. At this point in Earth's history, the major post-glacial transformations have largely completed their most dramatic phase. Ice sheets have retreated far to the north. Sea levels have stabilized compared to earlier rapid rises. Forests, grasslands, and wetlands now occupy their broad ecological zones in patterns that will remain relatively consistent for thousands of years. You walk along a wider forest path where the ground is soft but well defined. Layers of leaves cushion each step, and roots form natural patterns beneath the surface. The trees here are tall enough to create a continuous canopy in some areas, filtering sunlight into a gentle, shifting mosaic. It feels less like an environment in flux and more like one that has reached maturity. A widely accepted archaeological perspective is that this period sees the gradual emergence of more consistent regional settlement behaviours in certain parts of the world. Particularly in resource-rich environments, people begin to return more regularly to specific locations, sometimes building semi-permanent structures. However, researchers continue to discuss how widespread or uniform this shift actually was across different continents. You move through a section of forest where the air feels slightly warmer and more humid. Moss grows thick along fallen logs, and small plants cluster around tree bases. Insects are abundant here, and their movement creates a constant, subtle background rhythm. The forest is no longer sparse in sound or life. It is fully populated. A small but fascinating detail appears as you walk. You notice signs of repeated human use near a sheltered area beneath a large tree. The ground is slightly compacted, and there are faint traces of ash mixed into the soil. This suggests a hearth site that may have been revisited multiple times. Such locations often become focal points in mobile societies, even without permanent construction. A lesser-known archaeological insight is that some repeated hearth locations appear to align with natural shelter features, such as wind-protected clearings or areas near reliable water sources. This suggests that environmental comfort played a significant role in site selection, although some specialists argue that cultural memory may also have influenced repeated use of specific locations. You continue forward and notice how the forest subtly changes composition. Certain tree species dominate in clusters, while others appear sporadically. This patchiness reflects long-term ecological competition and adaptation. The forest is not uniform. It is a dynamic system that maintains diversity through balance rather than consistency. As you walk, you hear more distinct animal movement now, not just distant rustling, but clearer signs of presence. Birds move between branches. Small mammals shift through undergrowth. The forest feels active at multiple levels, from canopy to soil. A widely supported environmental observation is that post-glacial forests tend to develop multi-layered ecological structures over time, with distinct niches forming in canopy, understory, and ground-level vegetation. Yet there is ongoing discussion about how quickly these layers stabilize and whether they are more influenced by climate or species interactions. You step into a small clearing where sunlight reaches the ground in full. The brightness feels warm and steady. Grass grows here in soft clusters, and wildflowers appear in scattered patches. It is a brief opening in the forest that feels almost like a pause in the landscape's complexity. Near the edge of the clearing, you notice small stone fragments again. Their shapes suggest careful working, though they are worn by time and exposure. These remnants hint at human presence that is not constant but recurring, woven into the rhythm of the environment rather than fixed within it. A quiet archaeological detail from this period is that many stone tool sites show evidence of maintenance and reuse rather than constant production of new implements. This suggests an efficient approach to material use, shaped by both necessity and accumulated knowledge. However, some researchers caution that preservation patterns may exaggerate this impression. You continue walking and the forest gradually becomes denser again. The canopy closes overhead in places, creating cooler shaded zones. The ground here is rich with decomposing plant matter, supporting a dense network of microorganisms and insects. Life is no longer sparse or tentative. It is layered and continuous. As you move, you begin to sense how deeply interconnected this environment has become. Trees influence soil moisture, soil supports plant diversity, plants sustain animal populations, animals shape vegetation through movement and feeding patterns. Everything is linked in subtle cycles that reinforce one another. A well-established ecological understanding is that mature post-glacial forests often reach a state of relative stability, where species composition changes slowly over long periods rather than rapidly. Yet environmental historians note that even these stable systems remain vulnerable to long-term climatic shifts or sudden ecological disruptions. You slow your pace slightly as the forest grows quieter, not empty, but balanced. The sounds here are layered but gentle, forming a continuous background presence rather than isolated events. And as you continue forward, you begin to feel that the world has reached a kind of equilibrium, not permanent, but sustained. A moment of balance in a much longer cycle of change. You move through a landscape that feels fully alive, yet calm in its own way. You continue deeper into this mature post-glacial world, and now the forest no longer feels like something newly formed. It feels ancient in its own right, even though in geological terms it is still relatively young. The trees stand with quiet confidence, their roots deeply embedded in soil that has been shaped by thousands of years of stability rather than chaos. The air is steady, carrying a softness that feels almost constant now. At this stage of Earth's history, the most dramatic environmental reorganizations have largely settled. What remains is refinement. Ecosystems adjust slowly, fine-tuning themselves over long stretches of time. Forest boundaries shift slightly. River channels subtly change course. Animal populations fluctuate within stable ranges rather than collapsing or exploding. You walk along a well-defined forest corridor where the ground is firm and evenly covered in leaf litter. The sound beneath your steps is soft and rhythmic, like walking through layers of accumulated time. Sunlight filters through the canopy above in broken patterns, moving gently with the wind. It feels like the forest is breathing in a slow, steady cycle. A widely recognized archaeological perspective is that by this point in the post-glacial world, many human groups in different regions begin developing increasingly structured seasonal patterns of movement. Some areas show evidence of repeated long-term occupation in resource-rich zones, while others remain more mobile. However, researchers continue to debate how universal these patterns truly were across different environments. You notice how the forest floor is rich with detail. Fallen branches slowly decompose, becoming part of the soil again. Small plants grow in clusters where light reaches the ground. Insects move through layers of organic matter, contributing to a continuous cycle of renewal that is largely invisible but essential to the ecosystem's stability. A small but interesting detail appears as you move forward. You notice a slightly raised area where the soil has been disturbed repeatedly over time. It may have been used as a temporary shelter site or a recurring stop point. The lack of permanent structure suggests a mobile lifestyle, but the repeated use of the same space hints at memory embedded in the landscape. A lesser-known archaeological insight is that some sites from this period show evidence of spatial organization even in temporary camps, with repeated placement of hearths and activity areas in consistent positions. This suggests an emerging familiarity with landscape layout, although some specialists caution that such patterns may result from environmental constraints rather than deliberate planning. You continue walking and the forest opens slightly into a transitional zone. Here, tall trees give way to mixed vegetation. Shrubs and young saplings fill the gaps between larger trunks. The light becomes more variable again, shifting between shadow and brightness as you move through irregular clearings. Birdsong is more noticeable now, forming a layered acoustic environment. Different calls overlap, creating a natural rhythm that feels continuous but not repetitive. Small movements in the undergrowth suggest a healthy diversity of animal life. From insects to small mammals moving through the forest floor, a well-established ecological understanding is that mature Holocene forests often develop complex food webs, with multiple interacting species occupying tightly linked ecological niches. Yet environmental researchers continue to examine how resilient these systems were to sudden disruptions such as droughts or localized climate anomalies. You pass through a narrow passage between two clusters of trees where roots form natural arches across the ground. The air here feels slightly cooler, as if the canopy is denser overhead. Moisture clings lightly to leaves and bark, giving the forest a faint, earthy scent. A small but intriguing archaeological detail appears near the edge of the path. You notice scattered stone fragments that appear to have been shaped and reshaped multiple times. This suggests careful reuse of materials, likely due to both practical needs and familiarity with stoneworking techniques. However, some researchers argue that such patterns may not indicate intentional conservation, but rather simple opportunistic reuse. You continue forward into a more open section of forest where light reaches the ground more directly. Grass and small flowering plants appear in patches, creating a soft mosaic of colour and texture. The environment here feels balanced, neither too dense nor too open, supporting a wide range of ecological activity. A widely supported archaeological observation is that during this stabilized Holocene phase, human settlement patterns in some regions begin to show increased continuity, with longer stays in resource-rich environments. However, scholars still debate the extent to which this represents the beginning of sedentary life versus extended seasonal occupation. You pause for a moment in this clearing. The air is calm. The sounds of the forest surround you gently, without urgency. Everything feels connected but not overwhelming, as if the ecosystem has reached a quiet agreement with itself. You begin to sense that the world you're moving through is no longer in transition. It is now sustained by balance, maintained through countless small interactions between climate, soil, plants, animals, and human presence. And as you continue forward, you realize that this stability is not an end point, but a long resting state in a much larger story of Earth's change. You walk on through a forest that feels complete, yet still quietly evolving. You continue forward, and the forest begins to feel less like a place you are passing through, and more like a world that is fully formed around you. The sense of urgency that defined earlier sections is gone now. Even the memory of ice feels distant, like something spoken about rather than directly experienced. The land is steady beneath you, shaped by long rhythms rather than sudden change. At this final stage of the journey, Earth has largely entered a stable interglacial period. The great ice sheets have retreated far to the north. Sea levels have settled into their modern pattern. Forests, grasslands, and wetlands now occupy their long-term ecological roles. This is not a frozen world, not a chaotic transitional one, but a balanced system that will last for thousands of years with only gradual shifts. You walk through a forest that feels deeply established. The trees are tall and mature, their canopies forming a continuous ceiling of green and filtered light. The air is calm, carrying only the soft movement of wind through leaves and branches. Beneath your feet, the ground is rich and layered, built from generations of fallen plant matter returning to soil again and again. A widely accepted understanding in archaeology is that this stable climatic period allowed human societies in many regions to develop more permanent and complex settlement systems over time. Agriculture begins to emerge in different parts of the world independently, though not simultaneously, yet researchers continue to debate the exact pace of this transition, as it varies significantly across regions and environments. You slow your pace as you move deeper into the forest. Everything feels connected in quiet, subtle ways. Water moves through defined channels. Plants grow in layered systems. Animals follow established patterns through the undergrowth and canopy. Even the soundscape feels balanced, with no single element dominating the rest. A small but fascinating detail from archaeological research is that some of the earliest signs of structured settlement appear near ecologically diverse zones, where multiple resources were available within short distances. These areas provided stability that encouraged longer stays and more complex social organization. However, some scholars caution that these patterns may not represent universal development, as environmental conditions varied widely across regions. You come across a clearing where sunlight falls gently onto the forest floor. Grass grows here in soft clusters, and small plants move slightly with the breeze. It feels like a natural resting point within the larger forest system, a place where movement slows and observation becomes easier. A lesser-known detail from environmental archaeology is that pollen records from this period show relatively stable plant communities over long stretches of time, indicating ecological balance compared to earlier fluctuating phases. Still, there is ongoing discussion among researchers about how sensitive these systems remain to long-term climatic shifts. You continue walking, and the forest begins to feel even more integrated. Everything seems to have a place within a larger structure. Nothing feels isolated. The trees, the soil, the water, and the animals all contribute to a continuous cycle that maintains itself with quiet precision. Birds move through the canopy in steady patterns. Insects hum softly in the background. Occasional rustles in the undergrowth suggest small animals moving through familiar routes. It is a soundscape of stability, layered and continuous rather than fragmented. A well-supported ecological perspective is that mature Holocene environments often develop long-term equilibrium states, where systems remain relatively stable unless disrupted by major external forces. Yet environmental scientists continue to note that even these systems are never truly static, and can shift over long timescales due to gradual climate variation. You pause again, looking through the trees. The forest extends in all directions, not as wilderness in the earlier sense, but as a structured living system. It feels both vast and ordered, as if every part is part of a larger design that is constantly maintained through interaction. A quiet archaeological insight is that many human cultural developments, including more complex social organization, likely emerged within these relatively stable environments. However, scholars continue to explore how much of this development was enabled by stability versus driven by human innovation itself. You take a final slow step forward. The world around you feels complete in a way that earlier sections did not. Not finished, but settled. A long equilibrium reached after countless cycles of change. And as you stand in this quiet forest, you begin to understand the full arc of what you've witnessed, from frozen landscapes to melting rivers to shifting ecosystems, and finally to stability that supports new forms of life. The Earth did not simply change, it learned how to balance itself. And now, in this calm present moment, everything continues softly, as it always has, and as it will for a very long time. You remain here for a while longer, surrounded by a world that has finally found its rhythm. Sweet dreams,